This is a reflection on 70 years of recent cultural history from a very personal perspective. The insistent question is simply, how did we get here? In some ways, the world has changed beyond all recognition in my lifetime. But human nature has not changed. The challenge of survival for humanity and for all life on Earth has intensified. But don't get me wrong, there's no golden age to look back to, no era when there hasn't been great trouble, suffering, poverty, war. There have been many beneficial inventions and achievements and campaigns and social reforms throughout my life. I'm not going to focus on those, even the great advances in medicine and science, because my concern here is not to be over-optimistic or complacent in any way when the overall impression I have now is one of urgency and of mounting danger alongside the great potential for our future world. My reflections are very personal. I'm not a politician or a sociologist or a theologian. I'm a playwright who has tried to observe and learn a few things along the way and speak the truth as best I can. I believe that now is the time to ask hard questions if we are to recover hope and move forward with courage into the 21st century and beyond. Will there be a beyond? It's up to us. I was born in 1953. Churchill was Prime Minister. Queen Elizabeth was crowned Queen, and there was a mood of national rejoicing and great hope. Hillary and Tenzing conquered Everest, which was an uplifting symbol for the whole world. I spent a lot of my childhood conquering sand dunes and pretending to be Edmund Hillary, while my great friend Paul Burbridge was always leading the way as Tenzing. There was a spirit of adventure in the air, not least in the sciences, as James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA a few days after I was born. One of the most evil dictators in all history died, Joseph Stalin, a man who was responsible for the death of countless millions. Perhaps there was new hope for the Soviet Union, despite the Cold War and the disturbing aftermath of World War II. But in the world of the arts, there was a prophetic warning that despite all the hopes and longings and dreams, maybe the human race was going nowhere. 1953 saw the world premiere of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where the characters are endlessly trapped in a cycle of hope and despair. Well, superficially, I was growing up in a safe world in Hoylake near Liverpool. There were no supermarkets, just the local grocers who took a weekly order, which was delivered in a cardboard box by bicycle. There were only 2 TV channels, BBC and ITV, and no daytime television. Mobile phones, laptops, streaming, social media, all these daily realities for us in 2025 were unthinkable. We had one landline phone, and when you picked up the receiver and dialed 0, the operator would answer and then connect you with the number you requested. You could even have quite a friendly chat with the operator. There were no algorithms, no AI, no long queues on the phone with multiple options. Life was very personal and simple, and generally far safer on the streets than it is today. At the age of 13, I was able to travel on the train from Liverpool Lime Street to my boarding school in Bath, all alone, in the care of the guard. It seems like a forgotten world, utterly impossible now. The 1950s is often parodied in films as this very conventional, stuffy and repressed world which was finally invaded by rock and roll and then liberated in a glorious and hedonistic revolution in the 1960s. But my own experience as a child was one of safety and simplicity. Steam trains were still running on the Wirral line 100 yards from our house, and I can remember lining up as a very small boy to wave to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh as they passed by. But underneath the benign and peaceful exterior, there were many lurking problems, serious challenges that were being ignored. 1953 was also a year when the new NHS was issuing face masks in London because of the terrible smog, a mixture of fog and coal dust. The River Mersey, where I grew up, was so polluted that no fish could survive, and there were signs along the Hoylake beach warning against shellfishing. In these last days of the Industrial Revolution, we were killing our planet. But it was not until Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring in 1962, imagining a world without birds, that any prophetic voices were raised. In the 1950s, we were utterly blind to all this. But one thing I was aware of, even as a small boy, and that was the threat of nuclear war. I grew up under the vast and cold shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The whole world was under this shadow. And when the Russians finally exploded their own hydrogen bomb in 1955, the Cold War had truly begun. My brother and I grew up believing that we would fight in a third world war. I don't think we thought of mass annihilation or the irrelevance of a land war. We just recognized that the world was getting more and more dangerous. Our grandfather was at the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. Our parents were in the Navy and the Army in the Second World War. We had many relatives who had fought bravely against the Nazis. In the 1960s, both of us were in military uniform every Wednesday in the combined cadet force at our schools. Somehow, we thought it almost inevitable that we would be called up one day. Major international events affected me, even at a young age, because I was the youngest in a family that discussed politics and world events. I was aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in October 1962, a 13-day confrontation between the US and the USSR, when the world came the closest it has ever come to nuclear war. President Kennedy compelled President Khrushchev to dismantle nuclear bases, which the Soviets had built in Cuba. It was a terrifying moment of who would blink first. And the aftermath of this crisis filled the air in the West, enough to affect my young mind, even when I was only 9 years old. I knew the world was very unstable, despite the safety of my environment, and somehow this filtered down into my imagination. I would be like my grandfather and my father. One day, I too would fight in a world war. You can imagine then the impact on me and all my school friends when President Kennedy was assassinated on November the 22nd, 1963. I remember exactly where I was when I heard the news. I was in the boot room at my boarding school when a Nigerian friend ran in and said, "The president has been shot." My friends and I were frightened, because even though we were only 10 years old, we thought that this might be the beginning of the Third World War. That night, we lay in bed in our dormitory, and the master on duty came in and sat down with us. He was very popular, a brilliant storyteller, and many evenings we would beg him to make up another story for us. But on this night, we said to him, "Mr. Fox, sir, what's going to happen now?" I will never forget his response, or the look of fear on his face. He said, "I don't know. I just don't know." He could have told us that American presidents like Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated in the past, and the world still carried on. He could have said something to calm our fears. But his own fears were overwhelming. He too thought that the Third World War was about to happen. It didn't, but the fears overshadowed my school days. In 1966, the year I went to a senior boarding school, a brilliant drama, a pseudo-documentary, was made by Peter Watkins for the BBC. It was called The War Game, and the depiction of nuclear war in Britain was so realistic that the BBC did not broadcast the film. There was a very reasonable fear from the government that it would cause widespread panic. Finally, it was shown in private cinema clubs, and this is how I saw it at school in 1969. Only the senior boys were allowed to see this film, but it generated such fear in us that we began to campaign for the old cellars beneath the school quadrangle to be turned into nuclear bunkers. But whilst so many people worried about a physical Third World War, something else was happening, slowly, gradually, like smoke seeping into a room under a door, through cracks in the wall, through a half-open window, a smoke of confusion, a fog of ideas and thoughts and philosophy and influences. While we worried about bombs dropping from above, a moral and spiritual war was taking place all around us. We were entering a Third World War of the spirit. I believe that men and women of good conscience are still fighting on this battleground. But a great many people, and indeed whole societies, are in danger of going under. Like the smoke-filled room, which changes so gradually and imperceptibly, many of us do not realize the imminent danger, and even welcome bright and shining new ideas, which can have unintended consequences and may even destroy us. For example, there are many ironies in my lifetime of events which seemed so positive at the time, which now look equivocal or downright disturbing. This, of course, can be true of impressive scientific discoveries like splitting the atom, which later led to the Manhattan Project and Hiroshima. But such unintended consequences can also spring from freedom in the arts, social reform, sexual liberation, and the great advances of technology. There are many such examples from the decade of the 1960s, the great decade of liberation. In late October 1960, there was a very famous trial when Penguin Books was prosecuted for publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. The prosecution considered it to be a breach of the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. I am a writer, and I value freedom of speech very highly. No matter what people say, sing, write, act, paint, my freedom to express my own views depends on a freedom given to everyone else. The overwhelming victory in this court case, which was supported by so many well-known artists, writers, and politicians, was very positive in my view. But it is widely acknowledged as opening a door in the UK to a much greater level of freedom and even license than was anticipated. It destroyed the power of the Obscene Publications Act and was one of the factors that led to the abolition of the Lord Chamberlain's office and the relaxation of censorship and laws in the theatre. As a schoolboy, I saw one of the first productions of John Osborne's play, A Patriot for Me, which had been previously banned because of its homosexual theme. And this freedom for the playwright and many other developments were good in my view. But the smoke that was beginning to fill the room, the subtle fog which slowly began to shroud accepted standards of decency and morality, was encouraging many to push the boundaries further and further. For example, the theatre critic Ken Tynan was the first person to deliberately use the F word on live TV in 1965, and he later created the infamous all-nude review Oh Calcutta. Meanwhile, in the US, Andy Warhol filmed Blue Movie in 1969, depicting a live sex act. And soon there was the little regulation of soft pornography, unavailable in my childhood, or later of hardcore pornography. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the internet helped to make pornography one of the largest and most powerful of all global industries. And now we have primary-age school children easily able to access hardcore pornography and sadistic violence on their smartphones. The noble fight for freedom of expression has had many good outcomes, but it has also led to enslavement and addiction and the extreme liberalization of culture, which is also one of the factors behind the absurd irony of cancel culture, the complete and diametrical opposite of freedom of speech. Everywhere we look during my lifetime, we see the law of unintended consequences and tragic ironies. Feminism was one of the many great forces which led to the championing of women's rights in the 1960s. One outcome was the liberalization of abortion and the vital attempt to end the curse of backstreet abortions and the stigma which surrounded this issue. The Abortion Act of 1967 aimed to give women the right to determine what happened to their own bodies, the right to choose. I've known many people on both sides of this argument. My point is not to make any judgments here or take any position. It is simply to point out another of the dark ironies of our age. Since medical advances have given women the ability to know the sex of their unborn child in advance, this has led to sex-selective abortion in many countries where male children are far more highly valued than female children. Many studies have been done on this, surveying the issue in India, China, and various other countries. There are estimates that as many as 100 million female children have been aborted. The right to choose. The irony of the word choose is also clear when millions of women are coerced in patriarchal societies which exploit the liberalization of laws which seem to promise so much freedom for women. A cause which has championed women's rights sits uneasily with this unforeseen consequence, which is having profound social consequences in some countries. But the very nature of the smoke-filled room, of our fog-bound moral compass, makes it very difficult to face or challenge such disturbing outcomes and contradictions. Maybe the most vivid element of the 60s, apart from the incredible music and fashion culture, was sexual liberation. The swinging 60s will forever be associated with sex, especially outside marriage. Joyful, glorious abandonment to hedonism and pleasure, and free love. All this was helped by advances in contraception, especially the pill, but also by a sea change in attitude, which was clearly demonstrated by the successful publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Philip Larkin, the poet, summed all this up brilliantly in a few lines. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Well, like many adolescent schoolboys, I was mesmerized by the 1960s. The miniskirts, the glamour, the promise of free love. But I was too young to take part in any of this freedom or excess. But the term free love is the heart of another great irony. It is clear in the decades that followed the era of sexual liberation that the chaotic breakdown of rules and boundaries and accepted behavior, the excessive so-called freedom outside marriage or stable partnerships, has led to widespread relationship breakdown, destruction of the nuclear family, crime, loneliness, and desperation. There is no such thing as free love in this sense, because human actions come with consequences. Broken homes, single parenting, multiple partners, absent fathers. The cost is incredibly high. In some ways, the freedom and famous liberation of this era has become a prison in which many unhappy people and damaged children are trapped. But successive governments are nervous in the context of our smoke-filled room to confront any issues of personal morality for fear of infringing on individual choice. Freedom, and indeed free love, is a cherished idol in the temple of our culture. And now to the final irony I'm choosing from the 1960s, which in many ways is the most seductive and the most dangerous. Technology. There is no doubt that the 20th century saw extraordinary changes in technological advance and science. And my grandmother was born in 1890, and as a little girl, her elder sister, my great-aunt Ethel, said to her, "One day there will be carts without horses." The rumor of the recently invented motor car had reached the family. From that horse-drawn world, the world of thousands of years of human history, my grandmother lived to see men landing on the moon in 1969. There may never be such an overwhelming change in human possibility in the span of a single lifetime. For now we can imagine a human colony on Mars and traveling way beyond the solar system. Well, when I was only 10 years old, Harold Wilson, who was soon to become Labour Prime Minister the following year, gave a very famous speech in October 1963. It became known as the White Heat of Technology speech. Wilson was very optimistic about the power and huge advantages of technology. He wanted the old-fashioned cliché of cloth cap-wearing Labour supporters to be replaced by the white coats of lab technicians. He attacked Luddites, people who always wanted to hold back the future and resisted change. He had a vision of a peaceful and highly productive Britain marching on the leading edge of technology. There was talk of a 4-day working week, of far less stress in professional life, huge advances for good in the world. But the irony is that although there have been so many wonderful advances, bringing great benefits in the world of medicine and travel and communication, today's world is full of high anxiety, professional and domestic stress, smartphones and social media, which have produced what Jonathan Haidt calls the anxious generation. In 1991, I was working as an associate producer in the documentary department of BBC Wales. I wrote and co-presented the series and the book Relax, Dealing with Stress. I worked closely with the renowned psychologist Carrie Cooper. I remember how he foresaw that emails would not be some great advantage in the workplace, a wonderful gift of technology, but a source of increased stress in a society suffering from what the Japanese call hurry sickness. Now people are burdened with hundreds of emails, sometimes sent from a desk on the other side of the office. Hundreds and hundreds of responses are required. Overwhelming. But in 1991, we had no idea how instant messaging, texting, social media and smartphones would come to dominate our lives. And despite all the good things and the positive communication, how the smoke was now billowing into the room, unseen, unchallenged, creating an entire generation of anxious children and even dangerously disturbed teenagers, as depicted so brilliantly in the Netflix series Adolescence. In a heartbreaking scene at the end of Adolescence, a father breaks down in his son's empty bedroom, grief-stricken at his lack of personal contact with his 13-year-old son, his ignorance of the online forces that were capturing his own child in the bedroom upstairs. How has this happened? How did we get here? This is not the wonderful world that Harold Wilson was predicting and encouraging, but a world where the big tech companies in Silicon Valley have the freedom to steal the hearts and minds of our children. So far from confronting these issues boldly, governments are collaborating in building the modern Tower of Babel, reaching to the sky, the great dream of AI technology. They talk about exponential developments in glowing terms. They play up the dazzling successes and huge advances in medical science. They play down the threat to employment, to artists, actors, and creatives. They ignore the huge stress caused by frustrating levels of bureaucracy, of algorithms, and multiple options at call centers which destroy the personal human touch, which was normal in the 1950s. They've made an idol of AGI, which could even become a deadly threat to the future of humanity, a possibility admitted by many leading pioneers of the industry. The white heat of technology may ironically burn us all up. Something that was clear from the moment the first atomic bomb was dropped in 1946, an advance in technology which was not mentioned by Harold Wilson. But I was one of those who grew up loving his optimism. His visionary leadership inspired a generation, and his courage in standing up to American pressure on Britain to join the Vietnam War saved my brother and I from being called up to fight. I've reflected a lot on the 1960s. It was such a glorious, exciting, and inspiring decade, so full of brilliant creativity. I grew up only 7 miles away from the centre of Liverpool, and the Beatles were local lads to us. My parents taught John Lennon's son, Julian, who was at their school for many years. I still think Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, their 8th album, was the greatest ever created for its originality, strangeness, mysticism, beauty. But the experimentation with drugs, LSD in particular, seemed to have an exotic feel then. Now Britain is awash with drugs. Drug poisoning deaths are at their highest level for 30 years, thanks to a 30% rise in cocaine-related deaths. Scotland, where I live, has the worst level of drug deaths in the whole of Europe. The great freedoms and liberations of the 1960s have their dark sides. And that great era of excitement and promise in politics, arts, technology, the world of my school days, was always a smoke-filled room. But the greatest change in my lifetime has been far more subtle than anything I've mentioned. And it is far, far more significant in understanding the challenges of today. Believe me, I am hopeful, and I have strong vision for the future. But I'm also a strong believer in making the correct diagnosis. Over-optimism in a doctor is not a good habit. One of my greatest friends was told His symptoms were nothing to worry about. He just had acid reflux. All would be well. When in fact he had pancreatic cancer and was dead within the year. There was an over-optimistic Prime Minister in Britain of the outbreak of COVID-19. It is very likely, according to the inquiry, that thousands of people died because of false optimism and failure to act quickly enough. In the same way, we need to look skeptically, seriously, with deep questioning at many aspects of our culture, ideas that we've come to accept so completely that the air we breathe has become contagious with half-truths, lies, falsehoods, dangerous assumptions, ignorance, and self-destruction. The greatest change is undoubtedly how we have come to see ourselves. When I was growing up, no one ever used the phrase finding yourself. It was unknown. It would have sounded strange. But today the concept is everywhere. In every magazine, film, Olympic or Oscar speeches, in the classroom, at the universities, on the streets, in every home. We need to find ourselves. We need to express ourselves. We need to be authentic, find the real me. I need to be true to myself. A phrase found in Shakespeare's Hamlet, but meaning something very different. Once upon a time, to thine own self be true meant integrity, living honestly, taking spiritual and moral responsibility. But now, to be true to yourself, to find yourself, is to determine who you are by what you feel, by what you want to be. For as everyone knows, anyone who has listened to athletes, celebrities, or millionaire businessmen and women, you can be anything, so long as you believe in yourself. Many US students who have been fed these lies by their culture, their parents, their colleges, become angry and disillusioned and will vociferously complain when they don't get an A star in a subject they're no good at. Of course you cannot become anything, achieve anything simply because you believe in yourself. My grandfather was a very brilliant mathematician. My father was also a wonderful mathematician. I was hopeless at maths, and it was a great achievement when I narrowly passed at O-level. But I had other gifts. And as the great 19th century thinker and art historian John Ruskin said, we need to find the perfect fit. We need to find where we belong, the gifts we have, how we can contribute to society as well as our own happiness. Put simply, and perhaps very simplistically, over the last 3,000 years there have been different models to describe the human being. One of the first from the time of Aristotle is really political man, taking part in society and its organization. And then there is religious man, which dominates the Middle Ages with the church defining rules, structure, meaning, which could be oppressive or highly beneficial. Then there is economic man, above all throughout the Industrial Revolution and through the developments of capitalism and communism, when the human being is defined in terms of earning and usefulness and placed in the financial organization of society. But beyond question, we now have something else altogether. It is psychological man. What you feel is what matters. Therefore, finding yourself, inventing yourself, having your own truth about yourself is what counts. No one should tell you what to be or what to do. Although ironically, society is doing this all the time, and contemporary culture can become intensely oppressive. Cancel culture, for example, thrives to the advantage of one vocal group and ignores or oppresses the freedom of speech of another group. We are in a world where the autonomous individual is God, has become God, where expressive individualism has become the dominant religion of the day. For as Bob Dylan sang, you've got to serve somebody. Human beings will always have an object of worship. And that object of worship can now be found staring back at you in the mirror. This is the greatest shift or revolution of thought that has taken place in my lifetime. Although this gradual change in the understanding of the self goes back centuries and has deep roots in 17th century philosophy, the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, Marxism, the impact of Darwin's theories, and above all the influence of Sigmund Freud. Some people have described our age as a culture of narcissism, others as the therapeutic age. And it's true, our need for therapy, self-help books, motivational speakers, YouTube inspiration, social influencers, our need for the high priests of our culture to pronounce absolution, to tell us that we're wonderful, that we can do anything, that there's always a way, that the future is ours if only we can lay hold of it, is more intense than ever. Because now we are lonely. We are gods alone in our personal universes. And gods need praise and worship. We need people who will come alongside us and join us in fervent worship at the idol on our altar, the idol of self, the autonomous self. I decide who I am. I choose my own truth. What I feel has a much higher authority than biology, for example, or religion, or governments, or family, or society. What I feel is what I am. To adapt the famous phrase of Descartes, I feel, therefore I am. One of the unforeseen consequences of becoming a god is that I start to blame everyone else, or society, or my parents, or religion, or my school teachers, or my husband or my wife, or the economy, or political parties for my problems. I cannot be the problem because I'm perfect. I'm omniscient. I am God, in sole charge of my self-made universe. It is others who are at fault, other groups, activists, right-wing, left-wing, homophobic, transphobic. I am God, and I am unaccountable. And so the problem, the evil in the world, must always be out there and somebody else's fault. This is the opposite of a truly spiritual sensibility and a very dangerous condition which leads to all forms of conflict and ultimately to war. In 1991, I worked on a film with Jeremy Irons based on Dostoevsky's short story, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. I had originally adapted and directed this classic and prophetic 19th century story for the Upstream Theatre Club in London in 1978. Dostoevsky imagines a man racked with despair who intends to commit suicide, but with the gun at his side, he falls asleep. He dreams that he is taken by a mysterious being to a perfect planet, just like the Earth. It is a perfect, unspoiled, uncorrupted world of complete innocence and harmony. But a terrible thing happens. Although the man is full of wonder and hope of the lives of these beautiful people who welcome him to their world, he becomes the agent of their destruction. He brings sin like a virus. He becomes like the serpent in the Garden of Eden. He alone brings conflict, hatred, lying, confusion, broken relationships, warfare. The problem is within. This is probably one of the greatest evocations of personal responsibility and true accountability that has ever been written. When the ridiculous man wakes up from his nightmare, he's changed. He resolves to live life in a completely new way. When I was 5 years old, I lay in bed on a summer's evening, and I saw for the first time, against the deep blue sky, the white trail of a jet plane. I did not know what it was, But this soaring pathway, this white cloud that stretched up into the heavens, filled me with hope and joy. I've never forgotten this. And whenever I see a jet trail in the sky, I will stop and look and remember that first joy, the hope that came flooding through my whole being. I had my whole life ahead of me and it felt good. I remember a similar feeling of intense joy and excitement, also connected with technology, when I watched the televised broadcast of men landing on the moon in 1969. It was the end of the 1960s, nearly the end of my school days, and this seemed to be an incredible symbol of hope.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I'm a hopeful person, and I still feel great hope for the world, for humanity, for my children and grandchildren. But hope is sometimes strengthened and sustained by taking the long view. Let me give some examples from my own life. In 1976, I wrote a play called Catwalk, which dramatized the diary of a Russian Orthodox Christian, a diary which had been smuggled out of the Soviet Union. It told the harrowing story of a man who'd been incarcerated in a mental hospital in Koshenko outside Moscow because he would not stop talking about his faith to fellow workers on the factory line. He was considered psychologically unstable and forcibly injected with antipsychotic drugs, because how could such a strong belief in God be anything other than mental illness in the context of an atheistic state and a completely materialistic understanding of the world? A Christian like this, especially one who insisted on sharing the source of his hope and joy and faith, was clearly insane. The play was performed in London and a few years later at the Edinburgh Festival. But imagine this. Less than 20 years after I wrote Catwalk, I was in Moscow, dramatizing the life of Jesus with Russian animators for a film called The Miracle Maker. It was a suitable title because it was a sheer miracle that such a massive project, at the time the world's largest animation project, could be a co-production between the UK and Russia, creating a beautiful film about the life of Jesus that would be seen by 50 million people around the world. I was the screenwriter, and it so happened that I was a Christian. But this was not a religious project. It was a collaboration between S4C Wales, the Welsh channel, BBC, Christmas Films Moscow, and Icon. I was in Moscow many times, and I even traveled on a research trip to Israel with the core Russian production team. My Russian friends were not Christians, but in some respects they were trying to recover their heritage of faith. The Russian director's grandfather had been a Russian Orthodox priest sent to a labor camp by Stalin. In a significant moment, he chose to have a Russian Orthodox priest come and bless the animation studios with holy water. There are many reasons why the film was so powerful, not least the amazing performances of Ralph Fiennes, William Hurt, Julie Christie, Richard E. Grant, Miranda Richardson, and so many others. But I think that the holy water played its part. 20 years on from Catwalk, the Berlin Wall had been taken down, the Iron Curtain had collapsed, and I moved from dramatizing extreme hostility to faith to the life of Jesus himself in the very heart of Moscow. As we look at the world now, with the terrible conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the widespread instability in Europe and the Middle East and far beyond, it is important to take the long view. Both my parents fought in a war against Hitler, and it seemed then that there could be no peace and Britain would be overwhelmed by the Nazis. People had to take the long view to survive. In 1979, I was involved in a service of reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants at St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast. And with others, I took theatre into the Crumlin Road jail at the height of the Troubles. Everything seemed dark and insoluble, but I saw such hope and love in the people of Northern Ireland. And in less than 20 years, there was the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, the beginning of what seemed to be an impossible peace. In 1979, I also made my first visit to South Africa, and I returned as a visiting lecturer in theatre to the University of Natal in Durban in 1981. This was in the darkest days of apartheid, and I was involved in a youth theatre project in Soweto, creating a trilingual drama in English, Sotho and Zulu. I worked with courageous people like Caesar Molibatsi, who were full of faith, righteous anger, passion for justice, but were also full of humour and love. I worked on a mission with Desmond Tutu. I experienced a racist regime which seemed indestructible. I returned to Britain and eventually wrote a play called The Fatherland, which was staged by Bush Theatre at Riverside Studios. It was about a black footballer and his family desperately trying to survive the evils of apartheid. The play had 11 black actors. It is interesting and sad to note that it would be almost impossible for me to write such a play now because I'm white, and it would not be considered politically correct, or I might be accused of cultural appropriation. Back in 1989, black playwrights in London supported me, and the theatre was a lot freer of such political and cultural issues. The play was a great success, and in many ways launched my career. But far more importantly, it was all about hope and the long view. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela became the president of a new South Africa. Once again, in less than 20 years from my first visit, unbelievable changes and liberation took place. One advantage of living a reasonably long life, I'm 72 now, is that you get to take the long view. There are extraordinary stories about the long view in the Bible, most famously Abraham, who had to wait till he was 100 years old before receiving his promised son. My father lived to be 100, but luckily I was born when he was 40. But the long view is clearly a significant issue throughout the Bible, when there is lament, despair, desperation, hope, and restoration. And in the Easter story, it is impossible to understand the true perspective around the events of the Passion until you come to 3 days later and the accounts of the resurrection. This is why there are more resurrection scenes in the Miracle Maker film than in any life of Christ that has ever been made. This is where hope lives, and it is important to remain courageous and hopeful at all times. In 2011, I was invited to give a talk to a World Health Organization conference in Edinburgh on the theme of hope and hopelessness. This later became a TED Talk. One of my points was that hope and despair are not opposites, but hope and cynicism are, because the cynic takes the view that nothing will ever change. It is a static view, essentially a hopeless view of life. Nothing can be done. Nothing will ever change. We're overwhelmed. We are doomed. Another idea I mentioned in this talk was the brilliant observation of the late Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi in the UK. He said that we need to create ecologies of hope. And by this he meant environments in which hope is likely to flourish. This is a crucial observation for our family life, our community life, our national life. One of the most significant ironies of the second half of my life has been buying an almost ruined castle in 1995, the year when Windows 95 was launched. A technical revolution that would lead to so much that was good, but arguably to so much that was bad too. My life at the castle over 30 years has been a very gradual and counterintuitive project, where the dining table has become a sacred place and fireside conversations have had great significance, and mobile phones and laptops are kept well away from all communal life. This culture began partly because I became very early on in this charitable project a single parent, bringing up 2 teenage boys. We resolved then to never eat meals in front of the television, to take time together, to discuss the school day, to deal with serious issues, to joke, to laugh and have fun in the context of uninterrupted meals where we always sat together around the table. Connection mattered, human connection. Just as technology was developing in an exponential way, in forms that would overwhelm family structure, create anxieties, damaging comparisons, access to pornography, addictive behavior, we were moving in the opposite direction. Our lives were not so much about communication as about communion, togetherness. And many arts and media people and people from every walk of life came to share this experience with us for periods of time. I had to take the long view, and it took 20 years to renovate the castle. But one of the greatest and most healing aspects is to live close to nature. We're blessed by sea and incredible bird life, by the flora and fauna, by the awe-inspiring night skies. I've lived in many cities, including Liverpool, Cardiff, Cambridge, York, Durban, and in every place I've found trees, flowers, cloudscapes, the moon over the skyline, a bird singing, buds appearing in the spring. It is not necessary to live in a castle or in the far north of Scotland to experience the life-giving force of nature. This is an incredibly important part of survival and creating an ecology of hope. My father was a bird watcher, and so often he would stop the car and take his binoculars and follow the flight of a bird. Even for half a minute, in a busy day, he would see something, hear something, be fed by the beauty of nature. All of this helped to make him a very calm person and a very good headmaster of a busy school. When I stop and ask myself, how did we get here? I can become overwhelmed when I look at the problems of our age. But it is easy to forget the ending of the famous Greek myth about Pandora. She opened a box at the dawn of humanity, which should have remained closed, and out flew all the troubles of the world. But there was one little creature left in the empty box, and she was called Hope. Some commentators, Paul Kingsnorth for example, have argued that our search for complete autonomy, our raising the self to the status of God, is repeating the original sin in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve ate the apple so they could become like God. If I become God myself, then I lose the concept of anything which has a higher claim on me than my own happiness. And at the same time, I lose purpose and perspective. And again, another irony, by relentlessly pursuing happiness, I cannot find it. Because true happiness, rather than some kind of temporary gratification, is a byproduct of a personal and beautiful life. True happiness may come from serving others, a life of sacrifice, or by putting others first, a heresy in our self-made, self-worshipping religion. André Gide, the great French writer, said, "Without worship we shrink." And for the time being, that seems to be what is happening to Western humanity. But hope flies ahead of us and sings to us and says, take the long view. When I visit Skara Brae on Orkney, a 5,000-year-old Neolithic village, I'm deeply moved by the closeness of that community on the edge of the sea, at the mercy of the elements. A world where survival must have been so harsh, and where life was no doubt short and full of suffering. Yet what strikes me is how close this community lived, how they must have interacted, how they had a structure and a support more like an African village. It was impossible to think of life then as an autonomous self or to live in the atomized world of mobile phones and private cyberspaces. The idea of expressive individualism or personal independence would have been absurd. These people were deeply dependent on each other and on nature. Their mutual dependency was not a weakness, it was a strength. I learned more about this profound truth in researching and writing my latest play about Henry Nouwen, the beloved son. Henry was a famous professor at Yale and Harvard who gave up everything to work at L'Arche Daybreak in Toronto, a community of people who had severe physical and intellectual disabilities. It was a reverse career move, from a high-flying and very competitive world to a place where everyone, able-bodied and disabled, were mutually dependent. No one in the core community could read Henry's books, and no one knew he was famous. He was just the same as everyone else. His old world was broken down completely, and he discovered that he was no more important and no less important than anyone else. He wrote eloquently about everyone being the beloved son or beloved daughter of God. I had to take the long view about this play because I was in rehearsals with a neurodiverse cast in a theatre in New York in March 2020. The pandemic then shut all the theatres down and my production never recovered. But finally the play has risen from the ashes and was premiered in the UK in 2024. It is one of the most hopeful pieces I've ever written. One of the greatest and most positive developments during my lifetime has been the widespread change in attitudes towards disability, and this is surely one of the most important and inspiring cultural changes of the modern era. But working on this play brought hope to me in another way. I realized that it was okay, and in fact essential, to be dependent, to need the love of others, to find purpose in serving a community, to be at one with our fellow men and women, instead of trying to be number one. Here was a world where many could not communicate clearly at all, but every single person was in communion. The images of Skara Brae, the Neolithic village, and the 21st century L'Arche centres I have visited remain with me. Can we learn something from this? Perhaps helped by our technology rather than hindered, is this an unrealistic dream? We can find new ways of finding one another rather than finding ourselves, discovering deeper family life, supportive communities, and strong nations, so that we can play our part in a good future for the world. And who knows, perhaps we can learn to depend on God again and to discover that happiness is the reward of a purposeful life, a giving, caring life. Perhaps we can discover through one another, through nature, through art and science, that worship is a rational response to the wonders of the universe, that well-doing is as important as well-being. Perhaps we can take ourselves off the throne at last and live a life of humility and love.